Thank you, Pat. Thank you for the introduction. Such a lovely room full of lovely people. How are you doing? Good lunch? Yeah, nice. Okay, so this talk is called Our Remote Working Toolbox. I'm James. I do work for Shopify. I'm going to say up front, this isn't me trying to sell Shopify to you. This is all the learnings that we've experienced over the last couple of years about how to do remote work well, that I think are applicable to you whether you are a remote worker or not. So I've packaged these things up, and what I'm hoping from this talk is that you'll come away going, hey, there's this thing, that thing I'd love to try in my team. So that's the idea. And the first slide has the first tool, which is an arrow for those at the back to see where I am on the stage. Hello, everybody at the back. So this is the craft of succeeding remotely and lessons learned. And it's really nice to be in Berlin. I haven't been here for maybe 5 years now. My previous company had an office here in Berlin, and I used to spend a lot of time in Prenzlauer Berg. And I used to go walking in the evenings, and Berlin is such a rich history meeting the future at any given point. An example of that was this amazing embodiment of Berlin, Negative Land, which is a now closed video rental store. Streaming ate its profits, but you could rent VHSs of old Soviet bloc films, and it was an amazing store. So I love Berlin. And one more fun fact before we get started, hopefully to add some credibility to the fact I'm talking about remote work. I live in the 307th least densely populated part of the UK, out of 317, like actually remote. We don't have any shops. The road that I live on has no name. And I have relocated. We all know about, badly named variables, right? And I relocated 2 years ago during the pandemic to be around all of our extended family, because that's the most important thing for me. And what's quite interesting is that we live in a house that used to be the pub, where Rebecca, my partner's parents, met each other in the 60s. So I think everything has some meaning in a sort of serendipitous, cyclical way if you look for it. So I really enjoy being there, and the internet's very fast, which is great. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to go through these things. We're going to briefly touch on the future of work, just to frame everything that I'm going to talk about. And then we're going to start going through all of these different tools that I would love for you to take away and try out with your teams. Firstly, we're going to talk about structuring your org when you're remote, and also hiring very quickly when you're remote. And then we're going to look at onboarding with examples from how Shopify does onboarding, and I honestly think we do it probably one of the best onboarding programs in the world, and I'd love for you to replicate it. Then we're going to look at norms, a fantastic tool that you can use to make working in your team much easier. And then we're going to go into async and writing, which is critically important. And then the last one's kind of a fake because it's a wrap-up and just a thank you. So it's 5 things, really. So let's get started. Let's talk about the future of work. And I think the future is now. Many things have happened over the last few years that have meant that we've had to change the way that we work. And this slide, I'm sure you'll remember all of this. I'm looking around the room, and everyone seems to be at least 3 years old, so you remember what the pandemic was like. And, joking aside, this was a really terrible, tragic time where lots of nasty things happened. And, personally, my family suffered a lot here. My dad declined in health during the pandemic, and I couldn't see him. But we also went through the biggest remote working experiment in history. And we didn't necessarily sign up for this. And we found ourselves at home with no proper working space, looking after children because the schools had closed, and generally everything just being very, very chaotic. But it was a watershed moment, and I'm pretty sure that in the history books, our great-great-great-grandchildren will probably study this period of time in the same way that when I was growing up, we studied all the major world wars, because so much happened here that has become a watershed. And I think also in the kind of classical story sense, you think about the Greek canon, like the Judeo-Christian canon of religious stories, through everything being burnt to the ground, something kind of inspirational and interesting can actually happen on the other side. And for us, that's the way in which we all work together in our industry. So the old normal is very old. The open plan offices that began in Silicon Valley at Hewlett-Packard started out in the 1950s, around about the same time they invented the transistor radio. These were people getting together in order to break down the management hierarchies and structures to sit together in these big rooms together so that it would hopefully give them some kind of collaboration, serendipity and convenience of all being together in the same room. But you have to remember that the tools that we have now are far, far better than the tools that they had then. And actually just one kind of British thing to insert into this is that Queen Elizabeth II, rest in peace, was coronated in 1952. So the open plan office is not new technology by any means. So the tools that we have now, Slack, email, GitHub, Microsoft Teams, Atlassian, we've seen all these plastered all over the talks. Whatever you're using is far, far better than the people had back then, which caused them to get together in the first place. And I know another piece of technology, which is the Bose noise-cancelling headphones. I bought those because I worked in an open plan office. So our tools are way, way better than needing to do this, and we can change. But the world has changed, and this is the sort of the headline of this talk, is that we, all of us as practitioners, owe it to ourselves to remaster our tools for a new era, which we're in right now, and we're going to be in the future. So now we're going to get into those tools. Hopefully that was enough motivation for you to listen to me for another 24.5 minutes. So firstly, we're going to think about org structure. Now, it's worth mentioning that Shopify is a fully remote company, but it went fully remote just 1 month after the pandemic happened. This happened actually after they just invested a huge amount of money in a 6-story office in Toronto, which then got repurposed into a meeting space that we can all now use. When we all were thrown into remote work at the beginning of the pandemic, I was reminded of this really great model from Andy Grove's High Output Management, which is this dichotomy when new things happen, that on one side, chaos reigns for some period of time. There's a new innovation, there's a new thing that happens. This initial shift to remote was full of opportunity, energy, and excitement, and also dealing with all the bad things in the pandemic. People were throwing things at the wall to see what would stick. Not everything stuck particularly well. One thing that didn't stick particularly well was social drinks with your colleagues every single evening on Zoom. But what we've had to do now, as the years have gone on, we've had to start to rein in this chaos. We've had to bring it back in and try and give some desire for order and efficiency for us to do remote work properly, sustainably, with some design, structure, and process that makes sense for us, because hybrid or remote is probably going to be part of our lives for the foreseeable future. And this applies to life as well, right? Any event you go through in your life that's meaningful or difficult, you have chaos for some period, and then you find meaning, and then you move on. And could go on about the dichotomy of order and chaos, and in between there's beauty and good music and all that kind of thing. But that's for another time. So the questions are, when you're growing a remote team, fully remote, during difficult times, you have these thoughts. You go, okay, well, how do we structure a global team? How do we collaborate, and how do we transfer context? How do we have an identity? And these were the kinds of things that I had to struggle with when I joined Shopify. I had the great privilege and honor of being the first director of engineering that they hired in the UK, which was great. Previously, my last company, I was running an org of 100 or so people, very structured, knew what we were doing. I joined Shopify, I was like, great, who was my team? And it was 3 people. And I had a LinkedIn premium account in order to try and make that team bigger. I'm sorry if I messaged any of you in this room while I was doing lots of sourcing and hiring. It was actually me. So the structure that we sort of fell upon as we were growing our teams was, obviously, some people think that you can just do everything asynchronously, we could be all over the world, but that doesn't really work for the every person, including myself. So the structure and the tool that I think you should use when you're thinking about structuring your teams is this, is that within each team that you have, you should be optimizing for real-time communication. And that doesn't mean you all have to be in the same location, but having just 1 or 2 hours difference between you is a very comfortable place to be in here, which means you can organize by rough time zone bands. You don't necessarily have to have the UK team and the German team. Europe has a pretty good reach of time zone. So within each team, you allow things to happen like pair programming, like meetings, audio calls, the ability to collaborate every single day together. But within the organization that you're in, the division or the department, you need to optimize for async communication, where maybe teams only have a couple of hours of overlap, which means that you need to have a completely new async division or department identity and culture that people really lean into. And what do I mean by async culture? What are the tools of the async culture that you should be using? Well, it's things like, instead of having status meetings, all of your projects have written updates that people can subscribe to, and then they can get in their inbox at any time of the day. That you do demos via video, that you record feedback for each other. That when there's something to celebrate, it's written and shared with the entire department. That there are social channels that all of you can post in the same way that you'd hang around in the kitchen and share your stories. You can share your photos and videos and everything that you've been up to in the right place. And what's most important about this is that leadership has to intentionally lean in. You don't just create this stuff and say, hey, go and use it, whereas the leadership are all together in one office, talking to each other synchronously. Leadership really needs to intentionally lean into the async culture in order for it to work. People replicate what they see. And something going even further here is, what if you had to build a division from scratch? I said that I was given a LinkedIn premium account and 3 members of staff. This is even harder because at Shopify, when I joined, most of the company was in the US and the Canadian time zone. In Europe, we didn't have a huge amount of context. We were also all new. So the thing that you do is you're coming in as like a director, you go, right, this will be my department, my division, and we're going to do this thing. But didn't have any people, didn't have any context. So that was kind of difficult. So this is what we did, and this is quite a good model. If you have to As you are budding leaders, you may get a headhunt email at some point to go, hey, come build out our European presence in this company. This model works pretty well. So context was the primary goal. So instead of saying that I'm going to silo a whole bunch of teams under myself and then stumble forwards doing things probably quite badly, all the teams that we grew, we embedded within existing initiatives, existing subdivisions, so that they could get on and support existing teams with their roadmap, learn about the code base, contribute to something that was already fully fleshed out. And the same was actually true with all of my senior ICs as well. I lent them out to interesting projects that were happening in different areas. And this meant, candidly, that I had to sacrifice some of my own identity, because when people said, well, hey, like, what do you work on in your division? The answer was kind of like, well, and there are some of my staff in the room who often have to answer that question as well. You sacrifice your identity, but you build these high-performing teams through getting them where the context is, getting them to contribute and to ship really amazing things. And now that we're sort of coming into the 1 year plus, we have enough context, we have enough momentum to evolve our own vertical slices in Europe that we can do things on our own. So sacrificing identity and leading through impact is one way that you grow in a remote environment with little context. So that tool might help you in the future. The next tool is onboarding, and onboarding is incredibly important, and it's essential because a great onboarding process dramatically reduces the time that it takes to get people from net negative to net positive contributors. And it's a one-time only opportunity. I'm sure many of you who've changed jobs in the last couple of years, if you have, that first couple of months that you spend at the company is like a dramatic honeymoon period where everything's amazing and you're doing all these cool things and everything's new, and you just have this kind of burning energy to get things done. So if you have great onboarding, then you can harness that energy to make sure that people are really set up to succeed going forward. And what's also interesting about onboarding, if you're thinking about building an onboarding program, and even if the market right now is kind of quiet and not super good, now's a great time to build your onboarding program for when it picks up again. Little tip. Onboarding is also a funnel where everyone who joins on the first day is at the top of this funnel where they don't really know anything about the company. And that's great because the onboarding can be applicable to everybody. And then as time goes on, you specialize and taper down your onboarding program so that it applies to specific crafts or specific teams. And this is what the onboarding program looks like at Shopify. It's over 4 weeks. I've indexed from 0 because I'm an engineer. And it starts with the first week of understanding the company. And what's really important about this is that when you join Shopify, you are told for your first 4 weeks, all you do is onboard. We're not going to throw you in at the deep end. We're not going to make you fix some gnarly production incident on day one. It's not trial by fire. You join, you have your first day, and you know that you're going to spend the first month learning. And that's actually a really nice, psychologically safe place to be in, especially when you're remote and you're in a new company. So the first week is all about understanding the company. We go through what our mission is, what our values are, what's our culture. We have videos from Toby telling us the backstory of Shopify and where things are going in the future. And then you ship a PR on Thursday, which is also super important. And then in week 2, we go on to building user empathy. So everybody dog foods the product. So every new member of staff at Shopify builds their own online store. They list products for sale. We make it difficult by saying that you have to set up a store in Mexico that pays taxes properly and ships to Canada and all these kinds of things. So you really get to understand what the product's like. And also we pair with the frontline support engineers so that people get to answer real support tickets from our merchants to see what they're asking about and what it's like to actually use the platform. And then we taper down into the third week where it's all to do with craft overviews. So we go through what is our technology? What frameworks do we use for certain choices? What's our overall architecture? And how do we get things done from an idea to a proposal, a prototype, and then building? And then you only begin your handover into your team in the final week. And you don't even join the Slack channels for any of the division or department until very, very late on in this process. Because we want to make sure that you've got time. For example, if we hire you as a back-end engineer, you might not have programmed in Ruby before. So you can take a 3-day 101 Rails course if you want to, so that you're set up for success and ready to land positively. So it's from generalism to specialism, it's passive through to active, and all of the sessions are facilitated by a really amazing internal team who do this thing as part of their job. And just going back to onboarding, if you set up a great program that tapers from generalism to specialism, then you do this. You accelerate absolutely everybody through this contribution curve, because this happens every time you join a new job. But it also happens every time you start a new project, every time you start working on a new code base. you're net negative at the beginning, and that's fine, because you require more support from other people to get your job done than you have as output. But it's a role of good leadership to accelerate people along this curve as quickly as possible. The next tool is norms, and norms are a fantastic tool. And the question is, should we tell teams how they should organize their work? Should we tell them how to be agile, in quotes? Should we tell them how to communicate? And my answer to that is no, we absolutely shouldn't. We should always favour autonomy over mandates, we should always favour freedom over structure, and fundamentally give people tools which they can then use to succeed, rather than prescribe things for them to do. And for example, if I wanted to play tennis as well as Serena Williams, and I watched 1,000 hours of footage of her playing, saw what she did whenever she received a ball, and then someone served at me, I would be useless, because I haven't actually just used the tools to learn. All I've done is ingest a prescription. And norms is a great way for your team to work out what they want to do. So this is an exercise that you can do around setting your communication norms. You can do this together. On one side, list out every single way in which you talk to each other, phone call, SMS, chat, and so on. And then these are just examples, but you can think about what's the kind of length of the message, is there a reply expected, what sort of time, can this thing come in after hours, and just get together as a team and just go through it and work out what you think is acceptable. And doing this is really interesting because even though it looks simple, there's a ton of nuance in here. But if you go through this as a team, it means that, in this example, after hours every single day, I can put my laptop in the drawer and forget about it, because I know if something urgent is going to happen, I'll get a phone call. So norms create safety. And this can apply to any collaborative process. You can do this for how you do pull requests, what's the acceptable time to first review, what's an acceptable time to something being merged. You can use norms as a tool to structure the way that your teams work. It's really, really useful. And just drilling a little bit deeper into the communication norms, why this is really nuanced and interesting is because it's actually all this spectrum, right? And this is something I wrote about. You can categorize all the different forms of communication between a synchronous and asynchronous spectrum. And you have to choose very, very carefully, because what you choose, especially as a leader, in order to engage with other people, sets the expectation for them how they get back to you. So if I send you an email, it's probably okay if you don't get back to me for a couple of days, because that's what email is like. But I have to make sure I use the right medium for the job, and also fundamentally understand the pendulum swing between the fact that synchronous communication is impermanent. And if I have a face-to-face chat with you, it's going to produce no documentation for the team. And then acting in the other direction, asynchronous is great for documentation, but it leaves you disconnected from other humans because you're not having any face time. So it's very, very nuanced, and it's a big pendulum swing that you need to navigate. Now, coming on to, I think, the most important tool that I think all of you can get better at immediately, just by being very intentional, and we can all get better, is about writing and asynchronous communication. Now, earlier we talked about context and how remote success comes from the distribution of context to the new teams, to new engineers, and to people, so that where they are, they get what they need. And I also, even earlier in the talk, talked about how we owe it to ourselves to remaster our tools for this new era, where, to be honest, everyone is remote in some way. Even if you're in the office, you'll have other offices. Everyone is remote in some way. We use the same tools. So the one tool that if I was to say, go away and get better at, it's writing. Because writing is the absolute essential tool for remote success. And we've seen this in previous talks. So you owe it to yourselves to invest in yourself as a writer and get better. And the best thing that I would recommend that you do is go and watch this lecture. So this is the University of Chicago Leadership Lab, and it's a course that they put on, a writing course for academics. And you think, well, hang on a second, academics are kind of smart, they know how to write. Well, they don't know how to write well, and I think we also suffer from the same thing. So how many people have received a design document that made absolutely no sense whatsoever? Who wrote one? Hey! And this is because of this diagram, right? So what happens is that you are all working at the forefront of knowledge because you work in technology. You're all building things that have never been built before, so that's fantastic. Good for us. However, in order to think about the world that we work in, we have to write stuff. Because you don't just sort of sit there and then you think about the feature for 4 weeks and then all of a sudden, like Athena, it bursts from your head. You have to write in order to think about the world. So you need to write your design document to explore the feature, to explore the design, to find the rough edges, and that involves writing. But the problem is that people go through that process, they think about the world, they produce their document, and then they send it to people. The problem is the text that they have produced was good for thinking, but it's not good for other readers. What you need to learn as you're writing is that there's further passes that you have to make that make it appropriate to your audience, by hoisting important information to the top, by using clear language, by speaking in plain English. So we really need to get better at writing, because writing to think is not the same as writing for others. It's a two-phase process. And those design documents that make no sense are not because the person doesn't understand. It's often because they don't know how to write for you. So we owe it to ourselves to get better at writing in that way. And you get better at writing through practicing. Andrew, you practiced quite a lot today. Are you doing okay? He's catching up. But the question is, how do you get the time to improve your writing? Hey, I'm sorry, Andrew. I'm so sorry. That worked pretty well. Thanks, Andrew. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So you need to find the time to intentionally practice your writing. And this fills people with fear, because they go, oh, God, do I have to start a blog? Do I need to write an article on this site? No, actually you don't. There are so many ways in which you can practice your writing every single day if you just intentionally use them as an opportunity to improve your writing. Number one, improve your documentation. What a great way of writing for an audience that isn't yourself. Who'd have thought? Yeah, make the boundaries of your team really clear and concise by writing really great documentation. You're practicing writing for an audience. You can even have it as the definition of done in your team, so that you have to write. And if you find yourself that you haven't got any documentation at all, then one tool that you can use is a documentation sprint. So why not at the end of your cycle or sprint or whatever time box you use, down your tools for a day and build your mini site from nothing. And I'm trying to find my team who did that, but it was a great idea, and thank you for letting me steal it. So a documentation sprint's a great idea, to spend time writing collaboratively, build a mini site, flesh out your docs. Chance to practice your writing. Another chance to practice your writing is asynchronous stand-ups. So we use a tool called Geekbot. There are many others that are out there that do similar things, where instead of having that meeting every single day where you rush your way through your status update, you can actually just very calmly write to each other and actually include lots of interesting information and links. And this is interesting because your asynchronous stand-up every day is actually your chance to journal what you're doing and create an audit log for your future self about what you've been working on. And if that's interesting to you, about writing every single day to give yourself an audit log, then you can transform into brag docs. Now, there's this wonderful article by Julia Evans called Brag Docs, and the whole idea is you create a document every single day. You just write down everything that you've achieved. And this could be big things like shipped the new feature, but it could just be reviewed a pull request, mentored somebody, did a pair programming session, helped someone solve a problem. Just write them down every single day, because you always look back on a Friday of a busy week and go, what did I even do this week? Well, you can look at your brag doc, and you can remind yourself what you've been doing. And then the next step from here is you can share this with your lead. Because if you share your brag doc with your lead, then they can see what you've been doing every single day. And hey, you've just generated your one-to-one notes. You know, all of this is like a building collaborative thing, which is really, really useful. So I think these are fantastic. And if you want to take this even further, and this is something that I do, is you can write an internal newsletter as another way of practicing your writing. So you can tell your story internally. So my personal internal newsletter is something that I write once a week. Sometimes it has things about what I've been working on. Sometimes it's interesting things that I've seen in other conversations with other people, articles that are interesting, ideas that are interesting. It can be full of things that we're celebrating. But the whole idea is I write this once a week, and just simple writing of just a couple of pages that I do on a couple of hours every Friday morning can have a really outsized influence, because through this internal newsletter, I have the CTO subscribed, I have our VPs of Eng subscribed, and I have really great conversations with them every single week just by writing what's on my mind. So I think an internal newsletter is fantastic if you sort of get into the practice of doing that once a week. So on to a bit of a wrap-up here. So hopefully, at this point, the checkpoint, there are a whole bunch of things here that you will go and take away and try in your teams. And I think that these work really well, whether you're remote or not remote. It really doesn't matter, because I think we're using the same tools. We can all use them the same way. And just to recap over what we covered. So we started off framing the future of work, and then we went into the tools. So the tools were thinking about how to structure your org so that we have synchronous teams existing within the bounds of an asynchronous department culture. That works really, really well. And then we looked at the onboarding program that Shopify have a 4-week protected space in which people only have to learn and don't have to worry about doing anything super stressful. And that accelerates people through the contribution curve from net negative to net positive. And it works really well. Like even a year on, I think back to when I was building my store, and then I go back to the store that I built then in order to test out new features. It's really, really useful. And then we looked at norms as a tool where you can sit down with your team and think about ways in which you, say, for example, communicate with each other. But it really could be any kind of interaction with your team. How do you do it? So that you don't have to guess in the future. You've already written it down. You've got your contract. And then we looked at a whole bunch of tools around asynchronousness and writing. And writing is so essential. You know, if you look at the internal tech emails, Twitter and newsletter, where whenever there's a US court case, they leak, but they don't leak, they publish all of the emails from these big companies. You'll see that all the big decisions that get made at big public companies come through writing. So in order to participate in this space, get good at writing. It's really powerful. And then we're here, which is at the end. And I just want to recap the one thing that I think is super important, is that the future of work is now. Everything really has changed. All of us can work together, collaborate each other from a computer anywhere in the world, just with a single click. But we really need to remaster all of our tools for the new era that we're in, because the ways in which we've used them are a shadow of the open plan office spaces that we all used to reside in. And I think there's ways that we can intentionally use them to get way better, collaborate better, be more efficient. And that's the take-home message. So all that really leaves is for me to say thank you. I'm always really, really happy to chat. I'll be at the office hours. I'm also Jay Stanier, pretty much everywhere. Happy to chat on Twitter and wherever. As Pat said, I run the engineeringmanager.com, which is my blog, my mailing list. And if you want to go super deep into any of these topics, I wrote a book on remote work called Effective Remote Work, and I was quite proud that the place where I walk my dog every single morning is the cover. A little win with the publisher there. And also a book on effective software engineering management, which was my first book, that many of you actually come up to me and said really helped you. So I really appreciate that. That was job done, if that's the case. So thank you so much, and thanks for having me, LeadDev.